Hi everyone. Thank you for joining me for another week of A Simpler Time True Crime, a podcast where I dive into unsolved cases from the early 2000s and before, challenging the notion that everyone was safer in a simpler, lighter tech, slower paced world. But this week, I'm doing something a little different. Being 5 months into this podcast, my reason exclusively covering unsolved cases is because my belief is that if we're going to create true crime content and also be consumers of true crime content, there has to be some meaning behind the content. A few months ago, I listened to the podcast Media Pressure by Julie Murray, which is also part of the Voices for Justice media production company, which was founded by Sarah Turney. Both Sarah and Julie are women whose worlds were turned upside down when true crime and tragedy struck their families and they lost their sisters forever. I'll link their podcasts and websites in my show notes so that you can hear their stories from them directly. Both are vocal advocates about the true crime genre and how podcasts and other content creation can be more ethical and victim-centered. Julie Murray even created the Engage with Empathy campaign. Here's what she says true crime podcasters can do to align with families and create ethical, meaningful content. Julie reminds the true crime community that the whole genre exists because of their tragedies, meaning the families, and it's the inherent responsibility to handle them with the acronym CARE, C-A-R-E. C stands for centering the victim, and centering the victim and those with most at stake, balancing public interest with potential harm. A, avoiding harmful speculation, and it talks about how consumers drive this industry, vote with your clicks. If this furthers the content or does it just simply entertain? Research responsibly, be critical and curious of content, have a great veracity of sourcing, and don't accept subjective interpretations as indisputable fact. And then engage with empathy, reminding us that families and victims do not choose these tragic paths, and engaging with them with a level of sensitivity is crucial. There's more on her website, but I just wanted to give the high-level overview. In full transparency, I had an idea for this podcast for years, but I hesitated because I didn't want to do something that was harmful or problematic. Once Julie provided this blueprint, I knew I could take my idea and utilize it to frame the work I'm doing. So with that, let me share why I'm switching things up to sharing 2 solved cases today. Rest assured, this will still be a podcast that covers unsolved cases that need attention. But I wanted to provide a glimmer of hope. Hope that all these cases I'm talking about do have a chance to be solved. I want to use this as evidence that long unsolved cases can get answers. But more than that, I wanted to discuss the messiness of it all. When I first started this podcasting journey, I found that many people preferred quote-unquote solved cases. To them, there was a story with an arc and an ending, where the bad guy is finally caught and justice, whatever that means, is served. And I truly do understand wanting that, but it's such an oversimplification. Even when answers occur, the person who is loved by their family and friends is still absent from this earth and nobody can bring them back. And sometimes finding out who committed the crime is as far as you get. I want to talk about that, and so I picked 2 cases that both were solved, so to speak, in the last couple of years, after years of being cold cases, but both have quite different stories and different endings. So please be sure to comment and share, and let me know what you think of this episode. And with that, let's get into it. This is A Simpler Time True Crime, the solved cases of Jasmine Porter and Donna Macho. I first want to talk to you about Jasmine Porter, a beautiful young mother taken from this earth too soon. Like what happens far too often, Jasmine's story was very underreported in real time. it wasn't until later, when there was a break in the case, that there was substantial media attention. And so, to tell her full story, I relied heavily on the original reporting of Chelsea Rose Marcius of the New York Times. She spent 8 months plus reporting on this case, and so I want to take an extra moment to speak to her efforts and make sure you know there are links to her original reporting in the show notes. There is no bond quite like that of a mother and her son, but Jasmine Porter and her son Jeremy had something that took it even a step further. They shared a birthday. On February 5th, 1996, they were just 11 days out from their shared birthday. Jasmine, who went by Jazzy to her friends and family, would be turning 37, and Jeremy would be turning 6. And they had so much to look forward to in the upcoming year, because Jasmine was 6 months pregnant with her second child. Jasmine was raising Jeremy alone and lived in an apartment building at 1706 Davidson Avenue between West 176th Street and West 174th Street. This is in the Morris Heights neighborhood of the Bronx, and her older brother Derek wasn't a huge fan of her living there. He described the block she lived on as, quote, unsettling, and he had helped her secure a place to live on Long Island. That's where they had all grown up, and that's where he still lived. Jasmine was actually planning to move there in just a few short days. According to her siblings, Jasmine was beautiful and talented. Jasmine and her sister Shauna were close. Jasmine would braid her hair, and they would swap and share clothes. Shauna loved to make Jasmine laugh because she would get her laughing so hard she couldn't even catch her breath, and that was one of her favorite things. She was an incredibly devoted mother to Jeremy and a hard worker. She was a professional singer with a beautiful voice, and she was very extroverted and made new friends easily. But her sister said that sometimes she was just a little too trusting. In an interview with a local station called PIX 11, she said, quote, she was very outgoing and trusted a lot of people. Everyone was her friend. I told her, not everyone is your friend, end quote. On that evening in February of 1996, Jasmine was hosting friends for a gathering. It wasn't a huge party whatsoever, just 5 or 6 people hanging out. She had put Jeremy to bed, and then one by one, the remaining guests left. Sometime later, Jasmine laid down herself and went to sleep. What happened next is known only because of the heartbreaking account of her son Jeremy. He first was awoken to the screams of his mother for help. When he bravely appeared in her doorway, he witnessed a man naked and on top of his mother. She was fighting with the man, and she yelled for Jeremy to run. But Jeremy never left the apartment. He later told a relative that the man was going to strangle him, but decided not to. After the man left, he noticed his mom was laying motionless. He knew the man had hurt his mother, and he remembered what his mom always did for him when he was hurt. She got him some ice. So the kindergartner dragged a kitchen chair over to the freezer, climbed up, and grabbed an ice cube, and then he went back to his mother and placed it on her forehead. He stayed there with his mother for the next 2 days. When he didn't show up for school, the school grew concerned. She had also made close friends with her building, and neighbors were also concerned that they hadn't seen her, and they decided to do a welfare check. They never could have imagined what they would find. Jasmine was laying there, dead in her bed, and little Jeremy had not left her side. When they came in, he was wiping blood from her nose with a tissue. Detectives who showed up to the crime scene discussed how eerie the scene was. Outside of her bedroom, her apartment was immaculate. For being a tired single mom in her second trimester, all the toys were picked up, the clothes were put away, and the dishes were cleaned. Jeremy's bedroom had a bright Barney bedspread, a skateboard, and the toy trucks were all untouched and put away. You would think everything was perfectly fine until you walked into her bedroom. There was Jasmine on the bed, her baby bump exposed with dark bruises on her neck. It was clear she had been strangled. Detectives went right to work and canvassed the neighborhood, finding out who was last with her, what her routine was, and if she had any enemies or anyone who would want to harm her. One detective was close to retirement and had delayed his retirement just to work on her case. Something about a pregnant mother being sexually assaulted and murdered in front of her son just made it impossible for him to let go. But leads were hard to come by. There hadn't been any witnesses besides little Jeremy. They interviewed people who had been at the gathering with Jasmine on the night she was murdered, and that didn't provide any traction. At least, not at first. In May of 1996, police got a tip that pointed at the last person to leave the party that night. That man was actually arrested and brought to trial on murder charges for her murder. But it wouldn't be that simple to close this case. The star witness who had named the defendant admitted he had lied about the whole thing, and the man was acquitted. This was obviously a huge setback. So much manpower had been poured into this lead, and the resolution just fell apart. Not only did they have to start over, they had lost precious time. And this would impact the investigation. It went from just being a cold case to an ice cold case, and there was no movement. In the meantime, Jasmine's family struggled to find answers themselves and move forward. Her family was fearful that the killer would decide to come back and harm Jeremy since he could potentially identify him. So Jeremy was sent to live with Jasmine's mother. They lived in anonymity on Dairyland Road in rural Woodridge, Sullivan County in upstate New York. His grandmother was so scared to let him out of her sight, she kept him to a predictable schedule and didn't let him do a lot of the usual things you do as a teen with your friends. Jasmine's brother Derek led his own private investigation into the case, trying to shake out leads and talk to anybody he could, but like detectives, he couldn't turn up anything. And that's how Jasmine's case would sit. The 90s turned into the 2000s, and year after year passed with no new leads. Then, one day in late 2020, NYPD Detective Robert Klein's phone rang. At 6'4", Detective Klein is a towering presence in the Bronx Homicide Squad. He is known across the city as a renowned cold case detective who works tirelessly on cases, with a proven reputation for getting them solved. And that was the reason he was getting the call on this day. There was a Bronx prosecutor on the other end, and he had a tip for Detective Klein. He had heard that there was jailhouse talk about an old murder victim named Jasmine Porter. Detective Klein decided to review the case to see what work had already been done. At the same time, he also reviews the time frame things were done in. Back in 1996, when this happened, and even in the early 2000s when it was being worked on more, the advancements didn't exist that do now to help identify perpetrators. If you think about it, DNA has been revolutionized by forensic genealogy or familial DNA, which really blew up after using it to find the Golden State Killer, which was really just 2018, which is mind-blowing when you think about it, because think of how many cases have been solved. So Detective Klein was looking for any missed opportunities. But cold cases don't play out like you see on TV. He first couldn't even locate her file folder. It took 2 months to locate it. When he was finally able to get his hands on it, he went through its contents. There were photographs of her pristine apartment. There were interview notes, forensic reports, biology reports, and the autopsy findings. There was information about her pregnancy gestation. I mentioned before, but she was 6 months along at the time. Then, something caught his eye. He saw a note that said Jasmine's fingernails were, quote, retained but not tested, end quote. Knowing that little Jeremy had said in his testimony that his mom was fighting the man who was on top of her, he thought about the possibility of DNA of the killer being under her fingernails, which could still be on those clippings. But he was deflated. One call to the medical examiner, and he was told that it could take months to find the clippings, if they'd be able to be found at all. So in the meantime, he went back to the drawing board and old-fashioned police work and hoped for the best. A couple of names stood out in the file. He felt they might be persons of interest, and he interviewed them, but there was nothing solid to connect them to the cases. Throughout it all, he kept in frequent contact with Jasmine's family. He kept a smiling picture of her near him and stayed committed to finding her answers. Detective Klein's own wife was 6 months pregnant at the time he first started investigating the case, so it really hit home further for him. By springtime, the nail clippings had been located, and by Thanksgiving of 2021, just under a year after the first phone call, they got the call they had been waiting for. They had a hit. After a quarter of a century, there was a name attached to the violent night that ended Jasmine Porter and her unborn baby's life. Gregory Fleetwood. Now, TV not only depicts fast-paced investigations with readily available DNA and lightning speed testing, they also show arrests being made instantly. How many times have you watched a TV show where they get a DNA hit and they all rush out to make the arrest? But even though this finding was huge, Detective Klein needed to dig into Gregory Fleetwood's past. And what he would find would lead Detective Klein to know that this was no mistake. He was on the right track. To understand Gregory Fleetwood's criminal history, you have to back up 12 years before Jasmine's murder. 21-year-old Denise Wiggins also lived along Davidson Avenue, not far from where Jasmine lived. On August 6, 1984, Denise rode the subway into Manhattan with her friend. She noticed a familiar face on board. She didn't know his name, she just knew he was the loner who lived across the street from her. It was Gregory Fleetwood. She didn't think much of it, and she didn't see him again until 6 p.m. that evening. She stepped out of a corner deli and was grabbed from behind. Gregory Fleetwood abducted her, dragged her up to an apartment, and sexually assaulted her repeatedly for 13 hours. He choked her until she lost consciousness. After she woke up, he decided to let her go. She took some time to collect herself, and then she called police. He was arrested on August 8th and charged with first-degree rape. But Denise was talked out of upholding these charges. Her parents implied that what happened to her would follow her in a cloud of shame. Gregory Fleetwood's sister also intimidated her and convinced her to drop the charges. And so she did. And without her, they didn't have a case. She did an interview with the New York Times about this and expressed intense regret for dropping those charges. Just a few years later, in 1987, Gregory Fleetwood himself would call the police. When they showed up to his Corset Avenue apartment in the Bronx, they found a 25-year-old pregnant woman deceased on the bed. Fleetwood explained to police that he had met the victim, Linda Miller, on the street, and they decided to go to his apartment and use drugs together. He stated that he had smoked crack and that it turned him violent. He shared that in the heat of this violence, he strangled Linda Miller and struck her several times before falling asleep. He said when he woke up, he found she was dead, and that he had not intended to harm her. He was charged with second-degree murder. However, Bronx prosecutors agreed to a plea deal that would have him plead guilty to first-degree manslaughter. He went to prison in December of 1988 and was paroled on August 4th, 1994, the very first day he was eligible for parole. And then he went back to Davidson Avenue. With his history of violence, police wondered if he could be tied to more crimes outside of the times of his incarceration, and they did see his name tied as a suspect to 2 rape cases in the mid-1990s, around the same time of Jasmine's murder. Both were women he knew from the neighborhood. It's alleged that Fleetwood would come across as helpful to women and would help them with their grocery bags to be able to get closer to them. One woman he raped inside her old apartment after she let her guard down with his grocery bag ruse. Another he raped in the stairwell, again, doing the whole grocery bag thing. One of the victims died of separate causes before everything could move forward, and it's unclear what happened with the other case. Investigators did track down the 6 people in the apartment and placed Fleetwood's photo alongside others to see if anyone recognized him as someone who attended the get-together that night, but nobody found him familiar. Detective Klein built a solid case for 20 months. Then, on August 8, 2022, Detective Klein waited with his colleagues in an unmarked car outside of Gregory Fleetwood's home. This normally would be handled by the department's violent felony squad, but he wanted to do the honors of putting the cuffs on Fleetwood himself. And that's just what happened. There, on Laconia Ave in the Bronx, less than 5 miles from where Jasmine was murdered, a 6'2" Fleetwood walked out of his apartment and was greeted by Klein. He was shocked but didn't resist arrest. Klein described his demeanor as meek and unassuming. The people in the neighborhood around him were shocked by the commotion and the allegations. A local business owner on Laconia Avenue said that Fleetwood was always helping people in the community. He would do their grocery shopping or help them shovel, and he was there anytime you needed him. In the months later, Detective Klein was able to meet Jeremy Porter, the little boy who stayed by his mother's side with the ice cube. He's grown now, in his 30s, living upstate in Rochester, New York, and working as a plumber. According to the New York Times article, Jeremy doesn't speak to many people about his mother and chooses to remain private. He still holds a memory of her eating chips and candy with him for his birthday. He also still has the memory of that terrible event. He, alongside the rest of his family, are grateful for Detective Klein's commitment to the case. Jasmine's sister, Shauna Porter White, said in an interview, quote, "That detective, I have tears in my eyes when I think of Detective Klein, what he did for our family. He treated Jasmine like she was his own sister," end quote. Gregory Fleetwood is now 68 years old. He has been charged with second-degree murder, and he is awaiting trial. He maintains his innocence. The next case I want to tell you about is the now solved murder of Donna Macho. This story takes place in February of 1984 in East Windsor, New Jersey. Donna Macho was 19 years old and living with her family on Cherry Brook Lane. The neighborhood was quiet and considered safe, and she was just getting her start in the world after high school. Donna was strikingly beautiful, and in addition to being a legal secretary, she was also modeling part-time. That was a gig she was hoping to make her full-time job. She was known as being quite popular and friendly. She also had a boyfriend, and the relationship seemed to be positive, no red flags. Donna was young and still financially getting on her feet. So while she craved independence, she wasn't quite ready yet to be financially in her own apartment. Luckily, her house had the perfect setup. She had a basement-level apartment made up in her parents' home. This gave her the balance of privacy and independence without the financial burden of getting an apartment outside of her family home. Plus, she was close to her sister and parents. On the evening of February 25th, 1984, Donna was watching TV in her apartment when her 14-year-old sister Julie asked to join her. The two watched scary movies in the early morning hours of Sunday, February 26th. Picturing this made me personally smile because I am 5 years younger than my next oldest sister, and this is totally something we used to do. I always thought it was really cool when my big sister allowed me to hang out with her and took special one-to-one time with me. And we totally used to watch scary movies together just like this, and I savored that time. Which is what Julie did on that night. The movie ended around 2 a.m., and they stayed up and hung out a bit longer until Julie got tired and decided to go upstairs and sleep around 2:45 a.m. Donna's mother and stepfather were upstairs asleep as well. Donna was a night owl, so she decided to stay up a little bit longer and watch more TV. In just a few hours, the sun would rise, and when the family got up, Donna and her car were not there. But nobody thought much of it at the time, Even though it was a Sunday, the hardworking Donna had already told her family that she planned to go into work to get a few things done and catch up on some things she fell behind on. So they assumed she got a head start on that and would be back. This is the pre-cell phone days, so they couldn't just send her a text to check in and have any chance that her location was shared. So lunchtime passed, and in the early afternoon, they fully expected her to be home for dinner. So sometime between 4 and 5, when she wasn't home for dinner, that's when they started to worry. Her mom went downstairs into the basement apartment to look for Donna and see if maybe she left something like a note behind. But she didn't find that. Instead, she would find terrifying clues that would send a chill up her spine. Donna's normally organized and meticulous apartment had things dispersed everywhere. When her mother looked around further, she noticed a blood-stained pile of clothes. She ran upstairs and called police for help. Given that there were immediate signs of danger for Donna, police skipped the usual thought process of, yeah, that young woman was probably just driving off to hang with friends, and their action yielded quick results. Officers called in a location of Donna's missing vehicle, a black 1979 Chrysler. It was parked on the outskirts of town on the shoulder of Millstone Road. It was on the border of the town of Cranberry. On the passenger seat sat Donna's purse with her ID, cash, and credit cards all still neatly tucked away. All 4 doors of the vehicle were unlocked. A closer look at the car revealed disturbing signs just like her apartment. There was dark red stains on the ceiling and the upholstery. Further testing would reveal that this was Donna's blood type and likely her blood. At the apartment and the car, police preserved as much evidence as they could with the ways they knew how at the time. There were sources of bodily fluid in both places. In 1984, there was little they could do but hope that science would advance in a way that they could use this evidence to their advantage. Police evaluated different suspects, conducted interviews, canvassed the neighborhood, and looked for other sexual offenders who lived in the area. They even tried psychics, but no sign of Donna turned up and no new leads developed. And the grief and pain of losing Donna and not having answers weighed heavily on her family, both mentally and physically. Her father, Ronald, died in 1991 at age 55, and her mother died the year prior in 1990 at just age 49. It would take over a decade after Donna's disappearance to have any new answers. On April 2nd, 1995, a Boy Scout troop out of the town of Plainsboro was setting up camp. A leader of the troop was walking around the densely wooded area with an abundance of underbrush when he stumbled across human skeletal remains. This was just off George Davison Road in the town of Cranberry. Police immediately suspected it was Donna. For starters, there wasn't that many missing people in the area. This was also not too far from where her car had last been found. There were jewelry and clothing nearby that looked like it could have belonged to Donna. Dental records confirmed within a couple of days that the skeletal remains were in fact Donna's. It was clear she had been the victim of a homicide, but so much time had passed and her remains had so much exposure to the elements, the medical examiner could not conclusively say if she had been shot in the head or hit with a hard object. Ultimately, he ruled her cause of death as homicidal violence. Police had a few people in their sights in the initial investigation, but they were really close-lipped about their names, and there was nothing they could do to prove any of their suspicions. That was all the way until April of 2023, nearly 40 years after her murder. Police worked alongside a cold case organization with financial resources and people resources. They found that there was still semen that had been collected in 1984 preserved, semen that had never been tested with advanced DNA testing. Authorities cautiously got their hopes up and, with good reason, there was a hit in CODIS. A man named Nathaniel Harvey, who had been one of the original suspects on their radar, was conclusively linked to the crime. Nathaniel had a long history of sexual assaults and was suspected to be a serial killer. Harvey's MO was largely thought to be that he would go into unlocked homes and windows where women were living alone or just were very isolated, and he would hold them captive and sexually assault them. In 1978, he got bolder with his approach. He followed a 24-year-old Middlesex County woman to her driveway and pulled in behind her at her Monroe Township home. He made small talk with her, and then he followed her closely behind as she entered her home, forcing himself in and attacking her. He raped her and beat her until she was able to escape out of a rear window and run to a neighbor's home for help. In an absolutely gut-wrenching side note, this woman had been raped by another stranger, 45-year-old Herman Schmidt, who had no connection to Harvey, just months prior to this sexual assault. The victim was able to identify Harvey in a photo lineup, and he was charged with rape, assault with intent to rape, atrocious assault, battery, burglary, and lewdness. He turned himself in on October 20th, 1978, and he was convicted of 4 of those charges and sentenced to 15 to 20 years in prison. 15 to 20 years is already way too few years for the crimes he committed, but to make it worse, you know what I'm about to say next. He was paroled in early 1983, not even 5 years into his sentence. That means he would have been out for just a year when he committed Donna's murder. In June of 1985, the body of Irene Schnapps was discovered in her garden floor apartment in Princeton Meadows. She was a widow, and she had been discovered by a coworker who went looking for her when she didn't report to work. It was discovered that she had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death with a blunt object, and then left naked on her bed to be found. A bloody sneaker print was found at the crime scene. On October 28th of the same year, Harvey was arrested for trying to kidnap a 13-year-old girl in West Windsor. When they searched his vehicle, they found a watch that was found to be missing from the Irene Schnapps apartment crime scene, as well as a sneaker print that matched the one at the Schnapps crime scene. So, in 1985, he was charged with Irene's murder. He went to trial in September of 1986. Harvey was found guilty, but all throughout the next decades, he played games with the legal system, recanting confessions, claiming he wasn't read his Miranda rights, appeal after appeal after appeal. He was one of just 8 death row inmates in New Jersey at the time capital punishment was eliminated in New Jersey in 2007. When police looked into him after finding the DNA match to Donna's crime scene in 2023, they found additional circumstantial evidence that tied him to the crime. For example, the wooded area was right by a farm that Harvey briefly worked at around the time of Donna's disappearance. Her vehicle was abandoned by a sewer plant that was within walking distance to Harvey's home at the time. Police suspected that Harvey surprised Donna in her apartment. Perhaps he had been watching the girl stay up watching scary movies through the basement window, since we know he liked garden-level apartments. When he saw her sister go upstairs, he waited for his time to strike. He then assaulted her in the apartment and likely forced her to drive to another location where the attack continued and ultimately her murder unfolded. But there was one catch to the conclusion of this case. Nathaniel Harvey had died. He died in November of 2020 in Southwood State Prison, where he had been incarcerated since the year after Donna's murder. He had been awaiting a 3rd trial he managed to secure in Irene's case. So police could never ask him about Donna's case, and Donna's surviving family could never have their day in court. Her sister Julie said in an interview that the case, quote, destroyed her family, the searching, the looking, the wondering, end quote. She talked about how they hired private investigators and trackers and psychics, and they put up rewards. She said, quote, we spent all the money we had. I'm glad the case is closed and it was him, but I feel he got away with it, end quote. And that's a big part of why I wanted to share Donna's case too. Even resolution to these cold cases, while they bring some element of positivity because there's answers, they can often open up old wounds for the family. and they don't necessarily cause some big wave of relief. Despite him being locked up for almost the entire time after Donna's murder until the end of his life, her sister still feels he got away with it. And I don't blame her, because he never did have to answer to Donna's crime. He got to die thinking police never had any clue. He never had to look her sister in the eye or hear her victim impact statement. And even though he was incarcerated, he got to live to age 70, whereas Donna only lived to age 19. Furthermore, if he had just been held in prison for the reasonable amount of time or longer that he was supposed to be in jail the first time around, she would never have been murdered. He wouldn't have been free to commit this crime. In many of these cases, familial DNA identifies a subject who died and who was never incarcerated. They just lived the rest of their life without any earthly consequence. So that's incredibly challenging for surviving families as well. So in wrapping up, my hope is that this episode generates two main things: hope and reflection. If there are family members who are listening to this podcast who are looking for answers, know that in so many cases they do come. And it's unfair you should have to wait for them in this way without knowing if they're ever coming. But there's still space for hope. And for the true crime content creators and consumers who follow and discuss these cases, it's just a good reminder to remember that nothing is as seen on TV. Words like closure and justice are thrown around flippantly in these situations, but for the families, they still have to live with this void and pain and trauma every single day of their lives. They can't shut off a podcast at the end of an episode and resume their lives normally. And hopefully that just gives us something to think about as we choose how to engage with true crime content. And as Julie Murray says, engage with empathy. Cold cases are very often solved with DNA and cold case detective resources, but all of these things are expensive and many departments lack people and resources. Luckily, there are some amazing organizations out there working to fund these efforts. I'm going to share some of them on my Instagram stories in the upcoming week, so make sure you're following @SimplerTimeCrimePod for the information. You can also follow me on Facebook page, A Simpler Time True Crime Podcast, and if you haven't already, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and tell a friend. Thank you so much for listening.